Hello, welcome to this video on stock market data labeling techniques. There are many labeling techniques. Here we'll be concentrating on triple barrier method because that's one of the most famous and widely used method for labeling stock market data. This was coined by Marcos Lopez de Parado in his book Advance in Financial Machine Learning, which is a 2018 edition. Triple barrier, as the name suggests, that it has three barriers, that is, two horizontal and one vertical barrier. The triple barrier method is used to dynamically set the upper and lower barrier for each observation based on their given volatility. So the drawback of the previous methods that was popularly used was fixed time zone method, which here you can see the formula that based on a tau, which is a threshold, the price of the daily price has been given a range. If it belongs to that range, then the labeling is 1, -1, 0, and 1 accordingly if it goes lower or higher than the price of the threshold. So this is one of the oldest used methods, but this labeling technique uses the next day's lag or the return for the fixed time zone method. The threshold is being used irrespective of the volatility, so it is not very it doesn't represent the current state of price or for the labeling methods of stock market data. Hence, the advantage of the triple barrier method is it's dynamic and it considers daily volatility. And this triple barrier method makes more sense in practice as it's a path independent. To make some sound decisions, and depending on how many days you're planning to hold the stock or what is happening for the stock during that period. So let's see the three barriers we were talking about. So here is the vertical barrier. If you're considering to label this day price, so you will be considering a vertical barrier. That means how many distance you're considering to be looked upon further up ahead. And there are two horizontal barriers where the price range is considered to label your data. So what are the labels we consider here is, one is if you consider label 1, if you're considering that price to be labeled 1, which is profit taking. So if we have this barrier, so if the price first reaches or first hits the top barrier, then we label the data as 1. So if the price hits the lower barrier first, then we consider it to be -1. That means we are stopping our loss. So stopping our loss further. And if in that period of time, that hold of 10 days, here that's configurable, you can use any number of days, but preferably 10 days is a reasonable time. So if you consider 10 days as a hold period, so within that period, if there is no price crossing the upper or the lower barrier and it first hits the vertical barrier, then that will be labeled as 0, which is a hold. That means we cannot guess what the price variation would be. That's why I keep it as a label 0. Let's look at the code, how this method works. So let's consider this triple barrier method for Apple stock. So considering downloading the data of 10 years of data of Apple stock from the Yahoo Finance package here. Now here we consider the daily volatility. We are considering exponential weighted moving average, which is a quantitative measure to evaluate time series data, and it's also being used for modeling volatility, daily volatility. So we are considering this formula, the method from here. So we are taking this method, and let us look at, you can also consider average true range as your volatility or indicator. So volatility indicator. So here we consider a hold period of 10 days as I showed you in the presentation, And also we are considering +2 and -2 standard deviation for the barrier. So here is the main method for triple barrier method. So here we are considering a Panda data frame having these column variable names. So when we're considering the vertical barrier, so as we mentioned that it is going to be 10 days of a hold period for the from the current date. So here is from the current date you're considering the 10 days holding period. For the top and the bottom barrier, so we consider the current price of that day into by taking the volatility into consideration. So you have the upper standard deviation, the volume, and the day's price, creating a dynamic top barrier. And also the bottom barrier is the negative 2 standard deviation from the current price. So if you see here, we can see that for the whole 10 years of data, you can see the top barrier values, the vertical barrier values, the top barrier, and the bottom barrier values. Now let's label the data. Currently just taking a column with none values, so we can put in the label based on our condition, whether it is crossing the barrier or not. So here is the labeling method. So if the price is crossing the top barrier, then we consider it to be a profit taking, so we label the data as 1. If we are considering the price to be less than the bottom barrier, then we label the data as -1, which is stopping the loss, further loss from happening. And if in case it doesn't touch any of the top or the bottom barrier, then before it hits the vertical barrier, then we label the data as 0. So here you can see the labeling of these data, each individual day's label. So here is a count of how many labels were 1, which is profit taking, and how many labels were -1, which is stop loss, and how many is hold, can be seen here. Let's put the graph of these price and see how it looks. So here is a graph of the Apple price we have taken for the past 10 years, and we took a price to label this data. So if you see, you have a top barrier and a bottom barrier and the vertical barrier of 10 days. So if you see here, the price range between this vertical barrier first hits the top horizontal line. So we label this data as 1. And if the price first hits, here is an example that what happens if there are 2 prices which hits top or bottom barrier. So here then we consider the first occurrence of the hitting the top barrier or the bottom barrier as the label, and we label the data accordingly. Here is the price hitting the bottom barrier first before it hits the vertical barrier. So this day's label will be assigned as -1. Here is another example of what if the price hits 2 times the bottom barrier, and what would we label the data. So the data would still be labeled as -1 because it's hitting the lower barrier. Even though it's hitting twice, we always consider the first crossing of the barrier before it touches the vertical barrier. This is an overview of triple barrier method. Thank you for listening.